government's Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. I'm the lead negotiator for Australia in the negotiations for a new international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And on behalf of Australia, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this webinar on the work of the WTO Dialogue on Plastic Pollution, Insights and Reflections for the INC process. After two years of negotiations, we find ourselves now only a few short weeks away from the final scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution in Busan in the Republic of Korea. This will be INC 5, and it commences later this month. INC 5 presents us with a historic opportunity to collaborate globally to end plastic pollution. Although we're closing in on securing an agreement on a new treaty, we know that some issues are still up for debate by the INC, including trade. We have co-sponsored this information session today to help inform our collective understanding of how different countries are already using trade measures and trade-related cooperation to address plastic pollution, as well as understanding what the role of trade measures could be in addressing plastic pollution and lessons on the compatibility of multilateral environment agreements and the WTO. Several trade-related matters have arisen in INC negotiations to date. These will likely be discussed further at the forthcoming INC 5. We hope the presentations and discussions today help to inform a common understanding of some of these trade aspects heading into INC 5. We are here today because Australia's INC negotiating team has been lucky enough to have access to the insights of the WTO Dialogue on Plastic Pollution through our Australian colleagues' work as a co-coordinator. Australia is one of 6 co-coordinators of this member-led initiative at the WTO, which is co-sponsored by a diverse range of 82 WTO members. The insights from the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution have helped deepen our understanding of the global plastics trade environment and our understanding of the context for the INC discussions. Just as the insights from the process in the WTO have helped develop our understanding on the potential role of trade measures in addressing plastic pollution, we hope that other INC negotiating teams also find it useful to hear directly from the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution coordinators today about their work. My thanks goes to our distinguished Dialogue on Plastic Pollution co-coordinators from China, Barbados and Australia, and the WTO Secretariat for providing their time to share their insights with us today. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the team at TESS for your contributions and work in bringing this event together. And finally, I'm honoured to introduce this webinar alongside Ecuador's Ambassador, Jose Valencia, Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. I'll now pass this virtual microphone to Ambassador Valencia for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, Mr. Hutchinson. Really appreciate to be here among friends, among colleagues that are deeply committed to this common goal of helping from the trade perspective to consolidate the world fight against the plastic pollution. So a few words to start this seminar. I commend very much to Australia, to TESS, and certainly to all members of the DPP for its effort in organizing this webinar. I believe it's pointedly, since we approach, as I'm going to mention that, to the, I hope, completely successful end of the negotiations in Busan, Korea. I have a personal understanding that things are going well. And I hope that by the end of November, beginning of December, we'll be in a position to reassure that something good is, that we have very good news for the international community, especially on the environmental global agenda efforts. So basically, I want to just mention something that perhaps for some of you is already known, but it's very good to restate it. The World Trade Organization's Dialogue on Plastic Pollution plays a significant role as the world intensifies efforts to tackle plastic pollution. The dialogue's efforts are particularly relevant to the work of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee established by the United Nations Environment Assembly. The INC is nearing a pivotal point in adopting a draft treaty at INC 5, which will take place, as I said before, in Busan, South Korea, from November 24 to December 1st, 2024. The DPP's journey began, as we may recall, in 2019 with the inaugural Trade and Environmental Week and the exploratory workshop on trade and plastic pollution. Since then, the DPP has evolved, encompassing 82 World Trade Organization members and co-sponsors, representing nearly 90% of global plastic trade. This collaborative efforts aims to advance discussions on how trade can be leveraged to solve plastic pollution, an international environmental challenge that affects ecosystems, economies, and of course, human health. Let me give a few numbers highlighting the significance of trade in our shared path to be part of the solution to plastic pollution. Plastic trade constitutes approximately 5% of global trade. We repeated that from time to time, and it's good to have that in mind, because certainly that means, or that gives us an idea of the relevance of trade in finding the solution that I already informed. The figures do not account for hidden flows of plastics embedded in goods, not classified as plastics in trade data. Recognizing this scale, the DPP has focused on identifying sustainable alternatives and standardizing non-plastic substitutes like seaweed and bamboo. Despite significant potential, a lack of harmonized standards remain challenging, especially in food safety and quality. Over recent years, WTO members have actively adopted trade-related policies to address plastic pollution. We have already not just commitment, but a decision of implementation from the WTO members. So how we can build on those already adopted measures, on those already adopted national policies. That's something that needs to be done. Over 2,020 measures have been identified across 85 members, ranging from bans on single-use plastics to support for alternative materials. Notably, developing and less developed countries are leading this change, accounting for 71 of these measures. However, technical cooperation and capacity building remain essential to support these initiatives, especially for developing countries and LDCs, which require specific assistance in areas such as access to technology and policy design. Looking ahead, the DPP aims to deliver concrete outcomes by the next WTO Ministerial Conference in Cameroon, scheduled for next year. One of the initiative members is Cameroon, by the way. Our approach reflects the DPP's commitment to inclusive dialogue. We draw on the expertise of stakeholders across civil society, science, and technical fields as we continue to bridge trade and environmental policies in the fight against plastic pollution. We're confident that once the INC work in Busan is completed and a binding instrument on plastic pollution is adopted and enters into force, the DPP will continue to contribute as appropriate to implementing the treaty. By adding trade policy to the upcoming treaty, the world community can consolidate a unified global response to plastic pollution, foster sustainable production and consumption practices, and create a future that reduces plastics impact on our planet. I mean, negative impacts on the planet, of course. Finally, dear friends, the DPP is an initiative that aims to cooperate and work in the WTO and in other areas of international trade, contributing from a strategic trade perspective to solving a sensitive component of global pollution, such as plastic pollution. So do not lose sight that our works or efforts are aimed not just to achieve immediate and important goals with regard to plastic pollution, but in the end, we are working for a bigger, more important agenda, which is the global agenda, and the trade has to be part of the solution. Once again, doing something in this case, from the perspective of combating from trade to plastic pollution. Well, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Valencia, and it's my great privilege always to follow you on a panel, and thank you for your leadership together with the other co-coordinators on the dialogue on plastic pollution at the WTO. My name is Carolyn Deer-Burbeck. I'm the Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, and we're really delighted to have been asked by Australia with support of the DPP coordinators to help make this event happen today. So my role here is primarily as the moderator for this discussion. So in that role, my first thing is just to note for everyone that this session will be recorded. So if you have colleagues, others who wish to review this event, we will make sure it's posted afterwards. I also just have been asked to provide very few short scene setting remarks. And all I would like to do in this regard is to really underline what an extraordinary achievement the dialogue on plastic pollution has been in the context of the WTO. It started just a few years ago with 16 WTO members led by China and Fiji, and now has an expanded membership, 82 members, as Ambassador Valencia mentioned, with 6 really committed co-coordinators, Australia, Barbados, China, Ecuador, Fiji, and Morocco, which again really reflects the diversity of the membership. It's one of the member-led initiatives at the WTO. It has the most diverse membership, and that's really a key strength. A further strength is that they have engaged consistently with a broad range of stakeholders, from civil society, from think tanks, and also from the business sector. And this has really been a quite unique and promising development in the context of the WTO. And I think the third aspect that's really important is this idea of fostering a collaborative effort and collective actions as necessary to tackle trade and plastic pollution, and also their focus on trying to generate concrete outcomes collaboratively. So we will have the opportunity today to hear from representatives of 3 of those 6 co-coordinators, China, Barbados, and Australia. They'll provide some more background on the history of the DPP, some of the work and findings that it has so far, its recent ministerial statement, and some of the work they're doing going forward. Importantly, and I think as Cameron and Ambassador Valencia referred to, the work of the DPP has really highlighted this diversity of national experiences already on trade and plastic pollution and the range of actions that countries are already taking. So it's an opportunity to learn more about that as well. So we'll have the pleasure to hear from Xiaohui Zhang, who is the first secretary of the Permanent Mission of China to the WTO, followed by Shani Griffith, who's a counselor at the Permanent Mission of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. And then finally from Dinesh, I'm going to destroy your name, Dinesh, and I'm sorry, Tanintiracha, who is the third secretary of Australia's Permanent Mission to the WTO. Then we're very pleased to have today the presence of Daniel Ramos, who is the secretary of the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution at the WTO Secretariat, and really is responsible for doing a lot of the day-to-day work and thinking to support the efforts of the DPP coordinators. He's also a leading expert on trade and environmental law, and will provide some reflections on what we know about the interaction between the WTO and existing multilateral environmental agreements. And finally, at the end, we hope to have about 15 minutes to answer a few questions from the audience. So in that regard, I'd like to please request that if you have any questions, that you pose them in the question box on the chat. And what we will do is we will select a few questions from that to pose to the panelists at the end. Just before I turn to Xiaohui, one thing I just wanted to emphasize, which I think reflects both what Ambassador Valencia and Cameron have said, is this tremendous scale of trade across the life cycle of plastics. So we have very clear evidence, and the DPP has really helped us understand that trade and trade policies will have a key role to play as we're seeking to address plastic pollution. And the key is to try and work out how we can do that collaboratively in a coordinated and a transparent fashion. If we want to transform global supply chains and production and consumption of plastics, we will need to think how we can transform trade, where the opportunities lie, where the challenges lie, and how countries can work together to do that. Trade can play an enabling role in supporting that transformation, and so can trade policies. But our challenge will be to work out how we can do so collectively, fairly and effectively and transparently. And that will help us create an environment that businesses and companies and investors can, a predictable environment that they can invest in the change that we need to see as well. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Shuahui, please, to provide a perspective from China on your work at the DPP.
Thank you, Caroline. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, afternoon, or evening to you joining us today all over the world. I would like to first thank TESS and Australia for organizing this timely session today, and also thanks ANC colleagues for the time today to exchange on our collective efforts to tackling this important issue. The challenge and opportunities on the trade and the environment nexus are rapidly becoming a price issue, and then call for action from members is definitely present in the WTO as well. So we appreciate the opportunity to share our experience with ANC colleagues today. The dialogue, namely DPP, as a non-negotiating forum in the WTO, was launched in November 2020. China is honored to have participated in organizing the dialogues since 2019. As a dialogue, we set ourselves to identify ways in which trade can play an active role in addressing plastic pollution by strategically considering trade as both a tool and an enabler. As our environment ministers noted at the UNEA 5, there is no time to lose, and our actions are needed to face this growing challenge. We are on the same page. We expect the WTO to play a unique role in helping members to come up with more coordinated, consistent, and effective trade-related measures, and foster bonds between trade, environment, and development. DPP has focused on trade-related actions within the rules and the mechanisms of the WTO that participating members could take collectively and individually to support global efforts to end the plastic pollution. DPP also make efforts to identify the special needs, challenges, opportunities of developing members, LDCs, SVEs, SIDS, and landlocked developed countries, and further pathways to integrate trade consideration into the broader sustainable development agenda. In December 2021, in DPP's first ministerial statement, 77 trade ministers from the dialogue called for concrete, pragmatic, and effective outcomes through the dialogue. Since then, through intensive technical discussion, surveys, and workshop, and with the indispensable support of stakeholders, the dialogue has progressed technical work to help deliver trade-related outcomes that can help in the global efforts to address plastic pollution. As Ambassador mentioned, that WTO members are already acting, with our survey having captured more than 220 trade-related plastic measures already being implemented, mostly from developing members. The dialogue has made several significant contributions in advancing discussion on the nexus of trade and effects to address plastic pollution. Crucially, a key outcome has been that through our survey, we have been able to bring awareness to the role of trade measures in addressing plastic pollution, which is something that my colleague from Barbados, Shani, will be speaking later during the session. DPP maintains open, inclusive, and transparent engagement with our WTO members, relevant WTO committees, and relevant stakeholders from academia, civil society, private sector, and international organizations. For example, The dialogue has called for work in the World Customs Organizations to increase the transparency of global plastic flows, including the flow of hidden plastics, which we are proud to see that progress along with wider efforts to green the HS course, especially since 2022, when the historical resolution was adopted in UNEA 5.2. DPP has been keeping that our work is informed by and supporting the ongoing NC negotiation, as well as the implementation of relevant multilateral environmental agreements. Finally, at the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference earlier this year, the dialogue has been able to bring together 78 trade ministers to agree on a ministerial statement. Trade ministers collectively agreed on a set of principles and actions for the dialogue, which my colleague from Australia, Dinesh, will talk more. And very importantly, the trade ministers sent a clear and strong political message that trade can and must be part of the solution to the plastic pollution crisis. As Ambassador already mentioned, currently the dialogue has 82 co-sponsors, accounting for almost 80% of global plastic trade, including from developing and LDC members, as well as small island developing status. Our co-sponsors have been clear that our efforts in the WTO should focus on the trade aspects of the challenge and not prejudge, duplicate, or have a negative impact on NC negotiation. More than that, we strive to support NC discussion, including by providing valuable information on what is already being done in terms of trade-related policies, and the concrete capacity and technical assistance needs as identified in our survey and reflected in our outcomes. And we hope that our collective ambition and concrete actions in the WTO can help provide support and momentum to the NC negotiation. And we are ready to discuss on how to implement the treaty by the trade cooperation. I will now pass the floor to my colleague from Barbados, Shani, to speak on the result of our survey.
Thank you, Shawi. It is always a pleasure to present the work of the dialogue and what we are here at the WTO doing as a contribution to the international discussions on plastic pollution, including in the IMC process, and particularly on how we can ensure that trade plays a part in the solution to this global challenge. As Shawi would have alluded to, we undertook a survey on trade-related plastics measures, or TRPMs. And we did so in order to understand the types of trade measures that members were already adopting to combat plastics pollution and how in our discussions these could be built on. The survey has captured more than 220 policies that are already being implemented by 85 WTO members, and amongst them are mainly developing countries. The survey results have demonstrated a steady and important increase in trade-related policy measures and an exponential growth over the last few years. And this is much greater than all of the other environmental objectives combined and captured in WTO data, and mirroring an increase in interest and concerns related to plastic pollution. Based on the results of the survey, there were 3 types of trade-related policy measures, plastics measures, that were observed, and these can be classified under 3 broad headings. Firstly, sustainability requirements, and these have been in the form of technical regulations and bans or restrictions on the importation of waste And these accounted for around 83% of the types of trade-related plastic measures that were adopted and highlighted in the survey. Also included under sustainability requirements were minimum recycled content requirements and design requirements as defined within the context of sustainability. Secondly, taxes and other market tools. And here, the types of measures identified included taxes applied to specific plastics and chemical and deposit schemes, for example, extended producer responsibility schemes, tariff quotas applied to certain goods, and trade defense tools, which are mainly applied to substitutes. And thirdly, support measures. And here we would note that while support measures have identified preferential tax treatment and alternatives and solutions, this is one of the key areas where the dialogue could play a role in assisting this emerging goods and services aspect of developing the mature market and the ability to compete with established plastics. The one thing that we would want to note here is that it is clear that there is much more work to be done, including in identifying safe, sustainable, and effective plastics alternatives, non-plastic substitutes and refill, reuse, and environmentally sound plastic waste services. In the next slide, I think here you would get a visual appreciation of the range of 220 plastic-related plastic measures implemented by 85 WTO members. And here it covers the full life cycle of plastics, from feedstock and primary plastics all the way through to recycling. This information shows that countries were already cognizant of the need to act and therefore have put measures in place to combat plastic pollution and stimulate sustainable plastics trade. It also shows the potential for collaboration. For instance, we have in our discussion seen how many members are banning single plastic use bags, but the way that these have been defined across the different countries have varied slightly from case to case, therefore making it a bit difficult and costly to implement the restrictions. So collaboration is not only limited to the interactions amongst members, but also within the wide range of stakeholders within the various jurisdictions and within the DPP. And this is one of the strengths that we do see in the dialogue. All of this information has been compiled and attached to the DPP's ministerial statement and serves as a basis for future work. I will now pass the floor to my colleague from Australia, Dinesh, who will speak further on the DPP's ministerial statements, agreed principles, and actions.
Thank you, Shani. I'll round out our presentation today by briefly speaking on the ministerial statement that was agreed and launched at the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference earlier this year in Abu Dhabi. This included a series of principles and 6 trade-related actions to pave the way forward for trade to be part of the solution. The key principles, some of the key principles that were agreed among our co-sponsors included the need to focus on trade-related actions that participating members could take collectively and individually to support global efforts to end plastic pollution. We also noted in the ministerial statement the need for deepening cooperation to address challenges facing WTO members, as Ashwari mentioned earlier, in particular developing members, least developed countries, small vulnerable economies, small and developing states, and landlocked developing countries in the trade-related aspects of plastic pollution and their sustainable development goals. Additionally, also, another key agreed principle is a need to deepen cooperation with the dialogue is the need to deepen cooperation and collaboration with other international organizations, secretariats and processes, ensuring coherence and complementarity, avoiding duplication, and ensuring that our work is informed by and supports the ongoing INC negotiations, as well as the implementation of relevant multilateral environmental agreements. Coming to the actions included in the ministerial statement is that it notably called on members to improve transparency, monitoring, and understanding of trade flows throughout the value chain of plastics, including the single-use plastics, plastic films, and hard-to-recycle plastics, as well as those embedded in traded goods but not captured by trade data. This could be considered aka hidden flows, and this is something that Shao mentioned earlier in regards to the WTO efforts. There was also actions regarding improving the capacity of developing countries to use trade as a tool to tackle plastic pollution, to support efforts to reduce plastics and plastic products that are harmful to the environment or human health, or unnecessary single-use plastics and plastics packaging, to promote cooperative trade action to address the environmental, social, and human health impacts of plastics, to promote cooperative trade action on non-plastic substitutes, alternatives, services, and technologies, and to support the control of transboundary movement of plastic pollution. So with all of these actions, there was a related factual compilation attached to the ministerial statement, and this drew on the extensive technical work developed by the dialogue and provided examples of specific policies already being pursued by WTO members. And this was something Ashani just noted in the previous presentation that we gathered through the survey. So in the survey, there was 85 WTO members implementing more than 220 unilateral domestic trade-related plastics measures. And so from the survey, we could see that this has made for a trade landscape that is increasingly complex and fragmented. And so this can, of course, result in inefficient processes for exporters, regulators, and smaller markets. So the dialogue hopes to contribute to efforts to simplify this trade landscape through greater coordination. The dialogue is proud of our efforts to break the silos between the trade and environment communities, as is demonstrated, I guess, by this webinar that we're hosting today. This is all towards WTO ongoing efforts to deliver on the mutual supportiveness between the trade and environment communities, which we have been striving for since the establishment of the WTO and the creation of the Committee on Trade and Environment in 1994. The environmental imperative for action is growing, and we are proud of our co-sponsors rising to this challenge and recognizing the role that trade has to play in delivering on our environmental ambitions. At the dialogue, we set ourselves a target of identifying ways in which trade can play an active role in addressing plastic pollution by strategically considering trade as both a tool, as an enabler of our government's efforts to address plastic pollution, along with other environmental challenges. As our environmental colleagues that are on the line, of course, have noted correctly, at the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, there is no time to lose, and all actions are needed to face the growing challenge of addressing plastic pollution. And on that exciting and I hope inspiring note for our environmental colleagues as they head towards INC 5, we as the coordinators of the dialogue, thank you again for the time today and your attention. And I'll pass the floor back to Carolyn to introduce our next presenter for today's discussions.
Thank you very much to Dinesh, to Shuahui, and also to Shani for really excellent presentations and sharing with everyone very detailed, informative guidance on what has been happening in the DPP. I just wanted to note that my colleagues have pasted in the chat, for those who are interested, links to the various documents that have been referenced. I think Shuahui mentioned the ministerial statement, and so did Dinesh, and also the survey. We also put a link there to the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution's website on the WTO Secretariat's page. So another quick reminder before I turn to Daniel, which is that we're interested in collecting some questions you may have in case we have time at the end. I've received a couple, so if there's any more, please do send them along on the Q&A. And then with that, it's really my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Ramos, the DPP, the Secretary of the DPP at the WTO, to give us some background on the existing experience we have at the WTO, its relationship with MEAs. Over to you, please, Daniel.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you again for TESS, for Australia, and the coordinators of the DPP for inviting me, and of course, Ambassador Valencia, always a champion of this topic here at the WTO. Let me share my screen. I have a short presentation. Hopefully it makes it easier, and hopefully I also put it in the right format. I was informed I was in presentation mode, which is never easy to see. Okay, so let me just back here. Yes. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the relationship between the World Trade Organization, its rights and obligations, and multilateral environmental agreements. And just to note that this is not a particularly new topic for us at the WTO, or more generally at the multilateral the multilateral trading system. Sorry. Of course, as you, as the participants will know even better than I will, there are many multilateral, what we call here multilateral environmental agreements out there, and quite a few have specific trade obligations. And this is a term used from the beginning of the discussions in our WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, where delegations were interested to know more information and developments under all of these MEAs, but particularly on those that had these STOs, specific trade obligations. And from the start of the work of the committee back in 1995, they requested the Secretariat, the WTO Secretariat, to start to compile these obligations and to request that the secretariats to these MEAs presented developments on them. And of course, many of these MEAs have very specific trade restrictions, like trade bans or export or import licensing requirements, requirements to notify when there is trade happening or there are measures adopted that restrict trade in the covered products, packaging, labeling requirements. I think the best example or the one of the most traditional examples that normally we use when we do these kind of presentations is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, right? There are very strong and specific trade obligations contained there. And of course, we followed through in the Secretariat from this request, and we compile and continue to compile what we call an MEA matrix, and I'm providing there the link. And this is roughly updated every 2 to 3 years with the direct support of our colleagues in the Secretariat of these MEAs, and where we provide a host of information on these specific trade obligations, on decisions, recent decisions that have been adopted and that might impose or change the rules for trade in covered species, products, chemicals, etc. So I'm just providing you a list of some of the 20 odd, let's say, MEAs that we follow more closely. Now, then the question becomes, okay, what does it mean? What do these specific trade obligations mean for WTO obligations and rights? And here, just to recall, the WTO has a number of agreements that create rights and obligations, but essentially there are a few basic principles that permeate all WTO agreements, and these are on the screen. Non-discrimination obligation, and here is there are two, let's say, elements to non-discrimination obligations. You should not discriminate among partners. This is the most favored nation requirement for those that follow a little bit of trade rules, and also between imported and domestic products, and we call that national treatment. Then there is a general prohibition on quantitative restrictions, and there are also efforts to avoid the creation of unnecessary barriers to trade, and of course, transparency requirements. Now, if you think about it a little bit differently, and taking the very good presentation by Shani on these 3 different types of trade-related plastic measures that were identified, you can have the same breakdown for different trade-related environmental measures. So for any environment-related objective, but by that means you could also talk about other legitimate objectives like health, etc. And you have these 3 big buckets of environmental requirements, price and market mechanisms, and support programs. And for each one of these different policies, there are different WTO agreements that apply more specifically. Now, this is not the objective today to go into these agreements or to have a long legal discussion. This is just to show that as WTO members, they do have to be aware when they adopt trade restrictive measures in particular, that there are some rules that must be respected. But what does that mean in practice? Well, first of all, there is always a concern or a discussion on whether having to comply with these obligations, does it mean that members or governments would avoid adopting measures to protect the environment or other legitimate objectives? Well, at least for the environment side, we don't see that trend. So there on the screen is another thing that we do in the Secretariat based on requests from members, is that we track all of the notifications of trade-related measures made to the WTO. So as I told you, one of the basic principles is transparency. And we track and try to identify out of those how many are environment-related, how many contain at least one environmental objective when explaining why it was adopted in the notification. And as you can see, we have a growing number of these measures. I'm liking there 2023, which we just had the information issued recently, but the trend continues to go up. Not only that, it's a little bit harder to see, but below there is the percentage. Out of all notifications to the WTO, how many have at least one environmental objective among them. And at the beginning, it was around 8%, and it rose up to around 15% at some point. Now we're around 13, 14. So we have more environment-related notifications with also, it's a bigger percentage of all trade-related measures that we see at the WTO. And each notification can have many different measures. So as you can see, our database, and only looking here, this number is only from 2009 onwards, we have about 20,000 examples of these measures. Now, I just said that there are some rules that have to be respected, but I also mentioned that there are specific trade obligations in MEAs, and for a lot of those MEAs, the membership or the parties to the MEAs are the same as the members of the WTO. So how do we square the circle, if you will? First of all, members do adopt measures and notify to the WTO these measures that were adopted to comply with MEAs like CITES. They do ban, restrict trade in endangered species. And no measure taken under an MEA so far has ever been found to be contrary to the WTO rules. And this is because when we mention those principles, there's an important caveat. WTO rules allow the policy space for members to restrict and even sometimes ban trade as long as these restrictions can be justified. So in our language, these restrictions cannot create unjustifiable or arbitrary discrimination or unnecessary or disguised barriers to trade. In non-legalese, that just means that you can restrict trade as long as you can justify based on the legitimate objective that you're trying to do, and as long as you also take into consideration a few key elements that I'll finish now my presentation with. I think that the biggest message or the overall message is that, well, you can differentiate between, polluting and greener products. Discrimination for us is different than differentiation, but there are a few things that are important to keep in mind when adopting these measures. And this comes from years of discussions at the WTO, evolution of the legal discussion here, application of the obligations to certain environmental measures. And there are just 4 general considerations that I would like to highlight. First, the trade restriction has to be coherent. So the difference in treatment between domestic or imported products or restricted or non-restricted product has to be justified by legitimate objective. Second, the measure has to be mindful and holistic. What does it mean? It means that it's part of a general environmental policy or action and consider the impact on other countries as well as other national, regional, and international efforts on the same topic. Here is where having a multilateral environmental agreement where most, let's say, at least a good part of the world has agreed to do so in certain way also helps. Third, fit for purpose has to effectively, efficiently contribute to legitimate objective, maybe part as a national domestic conservation policy, and finally, has to be flexible, has to be result-oriented, and take into account alternative ways that could achieve the same objective at the same degree. I know it's quite a lot to take in, but I guess and I end with this general message again. There has never been a measure adopted to comply with an MEA that was found to be in violation of WTO rules, and the measures that we have discussed under WTO rules that have been found. There's individual measures, sometimes to not completely be aligned. The environmental purpose was never the point. There could have been something, a lack of flexibility here, or maybe some parts of the restriction that was not completely justified or couldn't be justified by the legitimate objective. But at the end of the day, the final measure was always protecting in a more coherent way the environmental objective. So I'll stop here. And happy to provide more clarifications if needed.
Thank you very, very much, Daniel, for a really comprehensive presentation and for setting out the issues. I'm sure many people will find that a really informative presentation, especially for those considering and trying to understand trade issues in the context of the INC as well. So we have a range of questions that I've received via the chat box that I'm going to share in a second. We have until 12:15, so we have just over 15 minutes, 20 minutes to have some back and forth. What I suggest I do is I will just throw out the first 3 questions that I received, and then I will leave the DPP coordinators in the room, and Ambassador Valencia, Daniel, you'll have to sort of coordinate in the room as to who is going to respond. So you can use amazing eye language or body language to work out who's going to take what, and also, of course, open to you, Cameron. Before I put forward some of the questions, I just wanted to note that I'm only going to pose those questions that really relate directly to the work of the dialogue and the presentations we've had today. The point of the dialogue was not to raise questions for countries about their particular positions in the INC negotiations or to reflect on those specifically today. So I'm sure there are many questions that you would all like to take up on that, but I think today we're just going to focus on the work of the DPP, and hopefully that will help inform people's understanding on some of the key issues at hand. So the 3 questions, and all are very interesting. One was to see whether there had been any reflection in the DPP among members of the Secretariat on the impacts of the different trade-related measures that have been considered or introduced to reduce plastic pollution. So this may be something that individual DPP members may wish to reflect on, whether they've seen them having had impact in their particular countries. The second question is one about sustainability requirements. And here the question is how countries think about what informs the intent of countries to ban or restrict certain types of production or products. And this person has also raised the question of the capacity of customs and various officials to adequately enforce such requirements at the border as well. And then a third question, and I will leave the 3 for the time being, is how can we ensure fairness or equity but among countries between the damage caused by those who are producing and processing plastics and those who are importing them and maybe have less plastic production in their countries. So I'll leave you with those 3 to begin with. They all have a good trade hook, and then I have another 2 afterwards, which I'll save up. So over to all of you. I hope you will jump in. I see beautiful coordination among the co-coordinators.
Yes,
there, which is
yes.
it's wonderful.
Okay, I'll jump in for the second question, and thank you to whoever passed that on to us on the sustainability requirements and what forms the intent of countries to implement bans. I'll be honest, it's not something we've gone into too much depth on, but from what we've heard in the dialogue, noting that it's sort of a discussion amongst different countries and sharing of experiences and what they deem to be best practices, I think one of the things we've heard is sort of, I mean, there's obviously the scientific technical basis for it in terms of the harm that it could cause amongst the different considerations. And this is something that was in Daniel's slides about the sort of objective and the rationale for it. But also, I think part of it is, of course, the sort of capacity of them to enforce that ban as well. So I think this is part of our strong push on increasing transparency in the WTO's efforts, recognizing that they're pushing for increasing transparency, but noting that there's a discussion amongst customs officials in the WTO and respecting their sort of expertise in that area of what is sort of feasible, because there's obviously a desire to break down different products amongst the plastic content or what's embedded and hidden. But then there's a competing, because of the sort of health impacts or the environmental impacts. But then there's, on the other hand, the sort of feasibility case on what's actually possible. And I think this is exactly where there has to be a discussion and a balance sort of reached between the different customs officials in the WTO to understand exactly where that appropriate middle ground is on protecting the environment and addressing the sort of harm that it causes, while also what's feasible for different countries. And I think this kind of goes to what we've talked about as well, what Shari mentioned about the sort of the need for technical assistance in this area as well for developing countries, because obviously different countries have different capacity to actually identify those hidden flows. And so technical assistance is a big thing that we've worked on. One of the proud achievements we have is this sort of matchmaking exercise in the DPP, where we help to sort of break down what are the specific needs of developing countries, whether it's SIDS or SVEs. What are the specific needs you need in terms of technical capacity and your ability to deal with waste? And then we have a lot of stakeholders or sponsors that we've developed networks with during our time in the dialogue, and what we do is sort of link them together where there's a particular sponsor with a particular project that they can assist a developing country with, and a developing country that says what their specific needs is. And so this is sort of recognizing that different countries have different needs, and so we're trying to address that, whether it's transparency or capacity, through the dialogue's matchmaking effort as well. We'll pause for a second before we answer the first and third questions.
Yeah, if I say something with regard to the third question, actually, the one regarding ensuring fairness among actors, countries vis-a-vis producing and processing and importing plastic products. I have to say this in not as a coordinator or something that we have agreed at the DPP, but as Ecuador now. We believe that the plastic pollution problem is a comprehensive one. It's a very complex one. You know, plastics are everywhere. We all know that. So it's the same in the world, economic production and trade of plastics. So what we have, the approaches that we prefer with regard to this matter is to see what every country, every actor, even every stakeholders can do with regard to the plastic pollution problem. How we can contribute to reduce, eliminate, and take measures against plastic pollution that we cannot control and that is affecting the environment, human health, etc. So that's exactly the importance of initiatives like TPP, because it provides us as a platform to coordinate efforts, to see what we can do, how we can complement each other. We need, as Shani said, for example, a special emphasis on cooperation, on technology transfer, in helping developing countries to receive technology and ways in order to help to solve this problem in their side. But also we need this global cooperation in order to produce, that's in the hands of the producer mainly, new products that diminish, for example, toxicity, that can be easily recyclable, or we can look all together for substitutes, for example. So once again, my message is that we have to see the whole picture and try to see how we can provide from our side, and we can do and forge an alliance, working together in order to reach those common objectives. Thank you, Karen.
And if I could add, I think not necessarily a perfect answer to the question with regard to fairness. From a perspective of Barbados as well, we are a small island developing state, very dependent on trade, both from the perspective of what we can export, which is limited based on our limited production base, but also as an import, as part of the tourism sector and every other sector, we're dependent on imports. And so from our perspective, even having a small market in terms of plastics and looking at the broader picture as it relates to climate and the impact that climate change has had on small island developing states and our continued existence, then it has to be a part of the programming, the policy making within the context of our national development plans, our climate adaptation objectives, and our sustainable development. And so even though there is going to be an impact on us, I think there is that collective need to see that we need to be doing things differently. The issue of plastic pollution is not one that is sustainable for us collectively. And so that idea of collaboration that you have heard around the table is something that we do take very seriously. Within the WTO, we do not at this point in time have a specific agreement as it relates to plastics. What we have mentioned in terms of the 220 plus measures that have been found are across the different agreements in the WTO, and Danielle would have gone through the various elements on SBS, TBT, and so forth. So one thing that we have found to be very important for us is the fact that for the first time, there is a specific reference to small island developing states and the specificity that these particular issues have when it comes to our types of countries, and the fact that the DPP has had that dedicated discussion on technical assistance and capacity building as it relates to developing countries, but more specifically, the voice of our countries within the context of those discussions and what it is that we need in the WTO as it relates to the trade-related measures that can then assist with helping us to be a little more sustainable, a little more reflective of the need for combating plastic pollution.
If you allow me, I also share my understanding on these three questions. I think to answer these three questions, maybe just one answer can help to understand these three questions. That in the WTO, especially in the DPP, we always maintain this dialogue open, inclusive, and transparent engagement from our WTO members. So it's and also relevant WTO committees and also relevant stakeholders. Or through this process, then we try to see what's the different voice from the different members, including the plastic products export members or import members, or the developing and LDCs, especially the small islands, status, etc. So we try to hear all the voice together. So we try to see how we can fight the common ground that we can solve this problem together. So we try to ensure the equality of the different members. In the meantime, if from the very beginning, the dialogue is very open to other stakeholders. So far, we have almost 50 stakeholders are very actively participant in this dialogue. So this is something that we really think is very, very important, because we believe that the WTO is a platform. WTO is not only, it's member driven, but not only only for the members. It's for the whole world, for different continents. My point is that for the delegation in the WTO, most of us are trade experts, but we are not environment experts. We must hear the different voice from the different stakeholders. So that could keep us awareness of what's the challenge, what's the real science-based solution. So regarding the capacity is thing that we try to support members, but also you see that we have a close cooperation with WCO, World Customer Organization. It means that when we try to figure out some solution, we always keep in mind that the feasibility, whether they can implement it or not. So this is something also is our efforts to ensure that the relevant government authorities or the relevant industry could implement some kind of policy from the dialogue in the future. Regarding the first question about the impact of the current more than 220 trade measures are already taken by members, I think it's very significant. We know that many members already take very good action. Just maybe one sample that many members have the trade measures, for example, the ban on the plastic waste movement. I think it's already a very good signal that many members are trying to have the new policy and to change the waste movement in the world is really significant to tackle plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiaowei. So we have just under 10 minutes left. So I'm just going to throw out 3 other questions that I received. If we can't answer them all, that's okay, but I think it's useful to put them out in the public anyway. So the first question is about who can decide whether there's a justification or not for exemptions to WTO rules. So for example, where your country might put in place a restriction or a ban on trade. A second related sort of legal question is what would be a response of WTO rules to the rights and obligations of a non-party to an MEA with any respect to any trade-related measures that might be in an MEA? So what does WTO experience of WTO rules tell us of that situation? A third one is much more specific, or maybe more simple to answer, is the WTO's dialogue considering opportunities and instruments to support and scale reuse of products to avoid unintended environmental consequences? And then the final one, it goes to the question of this idea that I think it's common to the DPP and also to the INC that we will be more effective if more countries are playing by similar rules as we're trying to transform production and consumption. And here the concern was, what if one region puts in place certain policies aimed at ending plastic pollution or providing a more circular economy for plastics, and others are not? What can be done to ensure that we don't have a sort of 2-tier systems where some continue to trade in products that maybe don't meet certain requirements, while others were having to meet more stringent requirements in the system? So it's a bit of an issue about competitiveness as we go towards this transition. So the questions I've received, my sense is, I think among our speakers there, we have some responses to each of those. But maybe to Daniel, I think the one on the legal issues is perhaps more suited for you to respond to.
Okay, I'm looking to my coordinators and the ambassador. I think yes, okay, for sure. I think I can take the first 2. Well, I mean, I would just, the first one, who can decide or not, I would just flip it a little bit, because it's true, a few of the obligations of WTO are written under exceptions or exemptions, but not all. So I try to simplify, and maybe it's too much of simplification, but I think the logic is the same. And the logic of WTO rules when applied to environmental measures is, whether through exceptions or rather through obligations, like there are agreements that they're not put as exceptions, is that there can be restrictions to trade. It's not an issue, but there needs to be a justification that is based on the legitimate objective of the measure, that you're not doing it to protect domestic producers, but you're actually doing it to fight pollution, to conserve nature, to control dangerous substances. The logic is that members are free, and they do all the time. That's what I try to provide you with, the thousands and thousands of measures that are notified. I like to use sometimes an absurd example. The WTO rules do not prevent you from banning toys that contain, are dangerous to children, or that contain, something that could be very harmful to them. That's not the logic. It's even in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement that established the WTO that the objective of this house and these rules is promote sustainable development. So it would be very strange if they would impose you to import children's toys that are harmful to them, right? So I think that's the basic logic behind it. It's that these measures, and we see them all the time, based on science, based on technical information, that are really there to protect health or environment, etc. They pose no issues with WTO rules. Then the second question on the restrictions to non-parties to NEAs. Now, we don't have time to go into the history, but there are technically still ongoing negotiations, part of the Doha round, to discuss partially that. So there's a point in the Doha round, which is the round of negotiations at the WTO, launched back in 2001, that tried to explore this relationship between WTO rules and specific trade obligations in multilateral environmental agreements. And one of the questions was that, essentially, what happens when there is a measure being implemented to, or being adopted to implement a multilateral environmental agreement, but for which not all WTO members are party to this agreement. And I'm sorry to say, members never discussed a lot, but never came to a conclusion. And now it's I'm under the control of my delegates and ambassador, but we haven't had more negotiations on these topics. And I tend to understand that since 2001, through different measures, through all of these measures being adopted to implement MEAs, the question is still interesting, but is not so pressing that members would be putting them forward to negotiate. We haven't had a lot of developments on this. And I'll finish with this, because the rules are still the same. And the rules is, as I said, if the measure implemented, even outside an MEA, is justified by science, by this legitimate objective, then of course having an MEA, having as all or part of the world agree on how to tackle an environmental challenge, this is very helpful. This really provides, let's say a roadmap for trade officials to also implement their measures. But and this already goes into the other question that I think the delegates are much better placed to answer.
Caroline, just make
please, over to you, Ambassador, please. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. No, just a very small view on this matter. We know perfectly what is the commitment of the DPP. We try to do something about plastic pollution from the trade perspective, from the WTO perspective, because we all are members of the World Trade Organization. I mean, the DPP members. So the values of the WTO remain there. And I think they are quite relevant for our purpose. The values of multilateralism, of cooperation, of working together on respecting the rules that have been accepted, So those are there. And I believe we have to insist that we certainly, there are circumstances when there are some sort of unilateral initiatives. And so, I mean, it's going to happen in the future, probably, yes, but let's try to have in mind that we have an organization and a rules-based system that we have to use in order to reach those purposes, that the exceptions are not the rule, in other words, but the common agreements that we had built in order to have this structure of international trade, which is the World Trade Organization. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Did anyone want to take the other two? I think it's almost time for us to close.
Yeah, I can quickly jump in, Carolyn, on the last one, because I think it's a quite important question on the impact of TRPMs sort of implemented on a regional basis without, say, common rules globally, and what the impact could be. And on this, we haven't necessarily seen it play out on that scale as of yet in the hypothetical posed. But from what we know from the 220 measures implemented domestically so far, that there will be an impact on, say, producers trying to develop in a sort of complex or fragmented landscape. And there could be a risk that producers align with the regulations of these sort of regional blocks which can exacerbate this sort of fragmentation. And so this is why we see coordination as key. Reducing fragmentation can help achieve both the sort of open trade goals, which, as Shani mentioned, is important to trade-reliant economies, not only SIDS and SVEs, but many economies that are quite trade-reliant. But sort of coordination can also achieve, not only the open trade goals, but also sort of the environmental objectives. So a very easy example is, say, if there's a non-plastic substitute that is trying to compete with plastics, which is obviously a very mature market, that non-plastic substitute, say it's seaweed, and it doesn't have the regulations in place or the sort of criteria or definitions in place to allow it to grow on scale. So if it's, say, a seaweed competitor, producer that's only has a market available to it that's regional and not large enough to grow at scale, it's going to struggle to compete globally. And if it struggles to have a global market and mature, then it might just struggle altogether. So this is where coordination and regulation can come in to help these sort of non-plastic substitutes compete globally and compete effectively in these sort of mature markets. Sorry.
Just to add, I think on this question of the scale and scope of reuse and whether there is consideration of this by the DPP, as part of the MC13 ministerial outcome, there are a set of factual compilations which either list, based on our discussions within the DPP, open, illustrative, and non-exhaustive products or technical assistance, some of which do speak to the issue of promotion of reuse. So nothing elaborative on this particular topic, but there are some elements there. The factual compilations are seen as guidelines or voluntary measures that members can look at. But at this point in time, I think the discussions within the context of the DPP continue. Unable to at this point in time say definitively yes, but reuse is continuously one of those issues that have come up in the talks as well.
Thank you very much, Shani, for that clarification. I think there were indeed a couple of presentations that were made by stakeholders around reuse as well, which you can find on the DPP website. So it's time for us to draw to a close. I'm very clear that that Cameron is there in Australia at a much later time of day than those of us based in Geneva. One other quick reflection that I wanted to make was, I think in the discussion around customs that came up, it would just be important for those who may not be aware that there is a Green Customs Initiative as well, which is sponsored by the World Customs Organization, where countries are offered or provided technical or capacity building support to implement measures, environment-related measures at the border or so on. So there is some support for that. You also raise a key point that a lot of the discussion in the DPP has been recognizing challenges that plastic pollution imposes, particularly on developing countries, but also their particular needs in terms of being making sure that there are market opportunities and we don't unnecessarily restrain their economic opportunities as we seek to transition to ending plastic pollution. So I just wanted to close by just reminding us all of the objectives of this panel, which were to provide some landscape of the global plastics trade, to identify some of the opportunities for cooperation on trade and plastic pollution, to listen and learn a little about the compatibility of MEAs and WTO rules, and also to hear a bit about national experiences. So I think we achieved all of those goals today. So from my side, I just want to thank again Ambassador Valencia, Cameron, Xiaohui, Shani, Dinesh, and Daniel for all of your contributions and remarks. And we'll just turn back to Cameron to close the webinar.
Thank you, Carolyn, and can confirm that on this longitude I'm still awake. I suspect there are others a little further east of me that are doing it tougher. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. A special thanks to those in the room there in Geneva, Ambassador Valencia, our esteemed trade experts and our co-coordinators. A fantastic discussion to bring the DPP's work to light and hopefully get some thought-provoking conversations happening about how we can tackle these things together, both in the WTO and in future discussions in the INC. And I would be remiss of me not to close finally by thanking Carolyn, your team again for bringing this together and hosting it. So thank you to you and the TESS team, and would like to wish everyone a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, and all the very best.
Thank you.